Hi, my name is Vesna Karapetrova, and we're here today at the Canadian Macedonian Historical Society on Tuesday, September the 29th, to interview Mr. Paul Christie. Paul, welcome, and thank you so much for coming here at our Canadian Macedonian Historical Society to share your story for our archives. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Vesna. I'm delighted to be here.
And let's begin with telling us, if you can please tell us when and where you were born.
I was born here in Toronto in March of 1952 at the Mayfair Hospital, which was a maternity hospital. My mother was there for just delivery.
Okay, and where did you live at that time when you were first born?
I grew up on Orchard Park Boulevard, which is at Queen and Kingston Road, very near my family business, which was the Mecca Grill, which many of people of Macedonian background in Toronto would be aware of.
Okay, great. And how about your parents? Where were they born and approximately when, would you say?
My dad was born in June 1917 on Eastern Avenue at Morse Street in the East End of Toronto, not far from where I live now.
And his name?
Alex.
Alex.
And my mother, Eleanor, was born on Coxwell Avenue near Danforth also in 1917.
1917.
Yeah.
Wow. And your father was Macedonian?
Oh, yes.
Yes.
My father was Macedonian. In fact, I believe, it needs to be corroborated, but I believe he was the first child born in Canada in the congregation at Sveti Kirill when it was on Trinity Street. So a very long time ago. My grandparents had been separated for a long time, and when my Dedo arrived in Canada, my Baba was almost instantly pregnant.
Okay, there you can tell us about the story of your grandfather. He was the very first pioneer who came from Macedonia to Canada?
Yeah, he came several times. He was born in the village of Oshchima in Macedonia, and when he was a very young man, he initially had gone to Turkey to be a stonemason, and subsequently decided that his future was in Canada. So he came in 1907 while my grandmother stayed in Macedonia. He was here for a couple of years.
And his name?
Karsto Mladenov. It's an interesting story how he became Christie, but that's a
yes,
later...
that will be interesting for later on. Yes.
Yeah, he came in 1907.
Karsto was his first name.
Karsto.
Okay.
Yeah, and he arrived here. He worked at the A.R. Clark Tannery on Eastern Avenue. He was a tanner. He didn't like the work much, I know that, but he did that for several years. And he was here for a couple of years and then went back to Macedonia, I would guess just after the First Balkan War. And discovered that there was turmoil there. My grandmother had a child not long after he left. He first left Macedonia and she was pregnant. When he went back, they had another child. My aunt Helen was the elder child. Then my uncle Louis, was born in 1912. And my grandfather again came back to Canada, and in 1916, despite reluctance, he insisted that my Baba come to Canada with the children. So she made the trip on her own, which must have been extremely strenuous. And,
with the children? With
the children during the First World War.
And this was
1916. They traveled from Oshchima to Solun. They had a boat from Solun to Naples. They subsequently took a much bigger boat, an ocean liner called the, why is it slipping my mind at this moment? It shouldn't, it'll come to me. Okay. But they took an ocean liner to New York City, and then the train to Niagara Falls. So my dad met them at the border and brought them to Toronto,
Right. When you say Oshchima, the village, whereabouts is it located in Macedonia?
In Lerensko, about halfway between Kostur and Lerin.
So that's the Aegean part of Macedonia.
Aegean, Macedonia, yeah.
Okay, and in the village, your grandparents, what language did they speak?
Oh, they always spoke Macedonian. My Baba, after coming here, lived 76 years in Canada and never learned to speak English.
Do you remember speaking with your Baba?
I did. We had a language of our own. I don't speak Macedonian. My mother was not Macedonian, so we didn't speak Macedonian.
And your mother is from?
She was Austrian, although born in Canada. This was very controversial in the time. My mother, I think, was probably one of the very first women who married Macedonian men. Certainly in the Cirkva, I would expect she may have been the first.
So this was very controversial in terms of your grandparents accepting her?
Yes, it took a long time for my grandfather in particular to accept my mother, but eventually they became beloved.
Great. And then your father, tell us about his growing up in Toronto and where he would have grown up.
He grew up initially on Eastern Avenue, and in 1928 my dedo built a restaurant at Coxwell and Queen, the Mecca Grill, as I mentioned before.
When was this?
In 1928.
1928.
And
this was the Do Cristo?
yeah.
Okay.
And he and my Baba, Dafina, operated the restaurant. I progressively had a bigger family. They came to my Baba came to Canada with two children, Helen and Louis, and then subsequently my father was born in 1917, and then they had a child who actually passed away in infancy, and subsequently they had my Uncle George and my Aunt Hope and my Aunt Sophie, all of whom grew up together. They lived in the building adjacent to the restaurant. They had a 2-bedroom apartment for 2 adults, 6 children, and 2 grandchildren who would come and visit in the summer. Really quite remarkable. I think they decided to open the restaurant 24 hours a day so that people would have a place to sleep.
Mm-hmm. And the restaurant, was it mostly operated by the family?
Yes, absolutely. For 55 years. They were there until the mid-'80s. It was very successful. It was adjacent to the Greenwood racetrack, the old Woodbine racetrack, and it cultivated a relationship with horsemen and patrons of the racetrack and the local community for over 50 years. So,
was it also popular with the Macedonian community?
Oh, sure. Yeah. It would have been very well known. My father was quite an entrepreneur, though. And he left the family restaurant in the early 40s to open a restaurant of his own called Montgomery's in Dundas Square at Yonge and Dundas in Toronto. And again, it was really quite successful. He did very well at that. Do
you remember being at the restaurant when you were small? You were not born yet?
I was not born yet. I was born in 1952. And by 1952, my father realized that the Macedonian community in Toronto was heavily focused on the restaurant industry, and he thought about businesses that would serve the restaurant industry. So he opened a vending company, and he served not just the Macedonian community, but hundreds of businesses with cigarette machines and pinball machines and jukeboxes, and was really quite successful at that too. And then, in the mid-50s, he and people from the Macedonian community, especially a man named John Mladenov, opened a business to build electric golf carts. They were a bit ahead of the market, but they established a factory in Ajax, Ontario, and built golf carts under license to a company called Electric Car of America. And it wasn't as successful, but it was an exciting time. He then sold his business in the golf cart business in the early 60s as well as the vending business, and became involved with a company called Red Barn, which was a fast food franchise that was very popular not only in Canada but in the United States. And he was the Canadian operation manager, and subsequently became a franchisee and held a number of franchises.
They were like burgers?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
In the 70s,
Some
right?
of the buildings still exist,
Yes.
but they're disappearing because they weren't built to last. So he was very, very successful at that, and he was enormously involved in volunteer work. Not only was he involved at Canadian Macedonian Place and with the Macedonian community, but in so many other endeavors. He was the president of the local Lions Club for many years. He was the founder of the Beaches Easter Parade, which is a very popular thing. And he initiated fundraising programs for a variety of local service organizations, Senior Link and the Apple Grove Community Center, and a whole host of others, and raised literally hundreds of thousands of dollars for people.
So fundraising was part of
he was really
his
good at
voluntary activities that he was really good at. And then his involvement in the Canadian Macedonian Place. How do you remember that as a child growing up? Because I know that your father was very involved, being a member of the board right from the start in 1971.
Yeah, he was involved from the very start with people who were so dedicated to the cause of building a place for seniors to have a dignified old age. And he knew that it was important, and he knew that our community would respond well to the challenge of a project of this magnitude. So he became involved with John Bitov and a whole host of people, and constantly was involved in fundraising and organization. He was very well connected politically, so he brought credibility, I think, to our efforts to have a place like this.
And you growing up yourself in the Macedonian home, I mean, with your father being so involved in the community, what kind of motivation did that create in you?
Well, I was always involved at a lesser extent. I can't claim to have had the influence that he had over the eventual success of Canadian Macedonian Place, but he would involve me in the fundraising.
Do you remember any particular fundraising events?
Sure.
Part of,
big. Every year we would have 3 or 4 events with hundreds, if not thousands, of people to raise literally hundreds of thousands of dollars. I remember in 1979, June the 8th, 1979, in fact, there was a testimonial for John Bitov that was just huge. And there was always the President's Ball and dances and the things that the Daughters of Macedonia would do that the rest of the community supported. And I was probably much more involved. Well, I know I was much more involved then than I am now, but I went to so many events of that kind. And encouraging my family to participate. We were all close to the cause.
Mm-hmm. And Paul, what would you say was the motivation for your father all along to get so involved?
Oh, well, I think he must have seen people of Macedonian background in their old age who didn't have the kind of lifestyle that we would expect and hope that they would have. Mm-hmm. Our community is tightly knit, but at that time, beyond relationships with the church, there wasn't a lot of opportunity to congregate. Mm-hmm. And I think that was as important to him as the notion that we would have a building with bricks and mortar. Just common cause. Let's get together and do something good for the Macedonian people.
Mm-hmm. And what church was your father and your family involved with?
Yeah, St. Cyril and Methody.
Mm-hmm.
I was baptized there, my sister too, and so many family events there. My very earliest memory, I think I would have been 3, maybe 4 years old, was being in the balcony of the the parish hall at St. Cyril for the wedding of my Aunt Sophie to Vasil Uvakov. It's so indelible in my memory. I remember my aunt leading the horo, and I thought we must be the royal family. Fantastic.
Great memories.
Oh yeah, beautiful. Wonderful.
Right. And so you grew up in the church, going to St. Cyril.
Yeah.
And how about your school life? What schools did you go to growing up?
Well, I went to Duke of Connaught Public School, which is at Woodfield Road and Queen in Toronto. Probably because it was close to my home, but there were schools closer. But to get to that school, I had to walk by the restaurant. So there would be some scrutiny on the way home and on the way to school. They were open for breakfast. So I went there, as did many people in the Macedonian community. My dad went there, and the Stavro family went there. And it was kind of a home for Macedonian people in a way. And subsequent to that, I went to a brand new high school, Monarch Park, which is now over 50 years old. But it was an adventure, and similarly, there were lots of Macedonian people there too. And after I graduated from high school, I went to Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, and subsequently to the University of Toronto.
And you have a very interesting political career.
I do.
You have extensive involvement both in provincial and municipal.
That's right.
Tell us about your start in politics.
Well, I had been a teacher actually when I graduated from university. I taught for a couple of years, and then I was motivated to be involved in politics, and I had a surprising opportunity to be a delegate to a leadership convention for the Federal Progressive Conservative Party. So I was elected to this role, and I subsequently was contacted by Brian Mulrooney, who had been very influential in Quebec prior to that time, and he encouraged me to come and help on his campaign, and I did. And while I was there at the leadership convention in 1976, I was encouraged by members of the Ontario legislature to come and work at Queen's Park during the time that Bill Davis was the Premier of Ontario. I did that as an assistant to a politician at that time, and after being there for a couple of years, I decided that I was writing speeches, and I thought I'd like to deliver the speeches rather than write them. So I sought the nomination to run for the legislature in the riding of Beaches Woodbine, which is immediately south of Macedonian Place on the lake, as you might imagine. And I was elected to be the candidate, and I subsequently ran in the election. Unfortunately, I was not elected. I lost by 200 votes.
Small
It was tiny, and disappointed obviously. And I had indicated that I'd like to do that again. So during the intervening period, I went back to Queen's Park and worked for a while, and then I was the administrator of the Canadian Organization of Small Business for a couple of years. And 1984 came around. I was nominated to run again. I assumed that I would be the candidate in support of Premier Davis, but shortly after I was nominated, he resigned, and there was new leadership, and it didn't go particularly well. So in May of 1985, I ran for election again, provincially, and didn't do well, and in fact did much worse than I had done in 1991, and I was resigned to the fact that I was never going to be a politician.
And that's when you decided to run for the Canadian Macedonian place, because you were on the board. Tell us about your time on the board there.
I was on the board prior to 1985. I think I was
1981.
1981, and I was on the board for I believe 4 years.
And this was a very busy time for you, because politically you were busy, yet you found time to volunteer and be on the board.
Well, I did, And one of the things that I did very briefly was to be the editor of the Zdravets newsletter.
This is the newsletter that the Canadian Macedonian Place publishes?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
And I enjoyed that. Although election time came around again in 1985, my wife Mary, who I had married in 1981, at the time that the 1985 election came around, was pregnant, and we had bought a new house. So we were very busy. The election went very poorly. I thought, well, I've got to get serious with my life and do something more substantial than hang around waiting for elections. But as it turned out, during the course of the summer subsequent to the May election, lots of people came to me and said, you should run for city council in the November election of the same year. So with a lot of encouragement and initial reluctance, I decided that I would do that. And fortunately, I was successful. It was a very strenuous time. 2 elections in 1 year really is an unbelievable hurdle. And I was constantly asking for people's support, both physically in terms of campaigning and financially. I never stopped asking people for money. And the Macedonian community responded so enormously. I continue to be gratified by how generous our people are.
Yes, and you mentioned that your father was a great organizer and fundraiser for the Canadian Macedonian Place, and he continued his involvement. He had subsequent posts as a director and even as president.
Yes, that's right. And he loved this place. It was so important to him. And I think it was as much the opportunity to be among people with whom he felt an instant bond, and that was true of everybody in the Macedonian community. He had so many friends. He lived an interesting life, and he passed away in 1992 at the height of his volunteer involvement. He wasn't a young man, but he did a lot of things virtually till the day he died. And when he died, the city of Toronto decided to name the pavilion in Kew Gardens for him. So where the jazz festival is and all of the community events that are held in Kew Gardens, where they take place is the bandstand named for him, and I think he would be gratified. It's the Alex Christie Bandshell.
Great.
Yeah, wonderful. It really is nice.
And maybe you can tell us about the Christie name, how your grandfather, coming from Oshchima, Macedonia, ended up having a Christie last name.
Well, it wasn't my grandfather himself.
No.
He was, as I mentioned before, Karsto, and I think what happened is that English people came to call him Christie because it was close.
Close enough.
And I have a suspicion, and I think it's true of lots of Macedonians, that when confronted with bureaucracy, either the bureaucracy or the individual would call themselves by a first name. There are Evans, Phillips, Mitchells, and Christies, and Andrews. Those names I think came about because they were essentially first names, and I think that was true of my grandfather too. So people called him Christie, and they just assumed his last name was Christie. But when he took my father to register for school, the principal said, "What's the boy's name?" And he said, "Alex." And then he said, "Alik." Then he said, "And I'm Christie." So it was Alex Christie, and this stuck.
This is how he got registered at the office in the school.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
And subsequent to that, he was a young man by the time that the Second World War came, and the selective service, the draft, they needed to know what his name was, and he said, "Well, my name is Alex Mladenov, but I've been Alex Christie my whole life." So they said, "Okay, well, this is it." So he became Alex Christie, even though his older brothers and sisters retained the Mladenov name, and the younger ones, by and large, were Christie. It's an interesting phenomenon. So I have first cousins with different surname.
And was your father involved in the war, in the draft at that time?
He was not. He was deferred because his vision was bad. His brother Louis was in the Air Force, and they did. I don't even know how to describe it. They did volunteer work. They made packages to send overseas, hundreds and hundreds of them. I know I've seen letters from soldiers who were in the war who were grateful for the package of food or socks or things like that were sent to them in Europe. So as much as he would have wished to serve, he didn't have the opportunity.
And we mentioned about his involvement in Canadian Macedonian place, especially being president from 1973 to 1974, and then from 1975 to 1976 being the president of the board of directors, which is quite honorable and an accomplishment. Did your father have any kind of formal education? I know you were university educated. Can you tell us about that?
Not much. He was a teenager at the height of the Depression, and the consequence of that was that his family simply couldn't afford to not have everybody working. So he worked to help support his family. He attended elementary school to completion at Duke of Connaught, and then he subsequently went to Melbourne Collegiate where he finished grade 10. But he was well read and obviously a smart man. It's a shame that he didn't have the benefit of an education. Who knows what opportunity might have emerged.
Yes, absolutely. And as you started to talk about your initial career in politics, how did your career develop in terms of being a councillor, and then what was next?
Well, I was very fortunate. I arrived at City Council in 1985, and it was a divisive council, actually. I guess I was perceived to be in the center or on the right, and then there were half of the council was like that, and the other half was New Democratic. Being on the center, I was able to be among the people with the mayor Aegean, who effectively decided the course of the city for the period between 1985 and 1988. And I was the chair of the City Services Committee, which performs all of the engineered services in the city, so sewer, water, waste collection, and subsequently the chair of the Neighborhoods Committee, which was responsible for the fire department and parks and the softer services. I had the good fortune of chairing the Daycare Grants Committee, so I learned a lot about daycare in a very short period of time. By 1988, I was obliged to determine whether I wanted to be a city councillor or a metro councillor, because there was a division of responsibility that year. So rather than staying at the city, I went to Metropolitan Toronto. I was elected in 1988 to Metro Council and was immediately elected the chair of the Works Committee, which also does water, sewer, and garbage collection and disposal on a much bigger basis. I served in that role for 2 years. I then became a commissioner of the Toronto Transit Commission and the chair of the Toronto Transit Commission, where I served until 1997. I had the good fortune of being involved in a number of very significant projects, including the opening and the extension of the subway to Downsview, the Shepherd subway, where I led the debate on extension of the service along Shepherd. I was the vice chair of O'Keefe Centre for a number of years. I was on a number of hospital boards, which I found interesting, and it was an interesting time. I was very fortunate to be there. And in 1997, again, there was a redistribution and amalgamation of the various cities in in Toronto into one city and Metro at the same time. So I was not successful in being elected to that council, but I immediately went to my own consulting business at that time, and it's been great ever since. And politically, I've had a number of roles since then, not elected, but some of our community would remember that in 2002, I was appointed by the province of Ontario to supervise the Toronto District School Board, which was a huge and very controversial job. The school board, as you probably know, has 550 schools and over 350,000 students, and I was solely responsible for all administrative and financial decisions made for those schools and children. And I was gratified that, excuse me, I had that opportunity. It gave me the opportunity to learn a huge amount about education, which I have the opportunity to share from time to time even now.
Mm-hmm. And I know, as you mentioned, and you probably have more projects than you can name here, but was there any project or initiative that you were especially proud of and close to?
Well, obviously we constructed some schools,
Yes.
which I was gratified to have the opportunity to do. And at the same time, there were a number of things that were suggested as ways to balance the budget of the TDSB that I thought were too painful. In particular, there are 85 swimming pools in the various schools in Toronto, and I was able to save those. And I'm delighted to do that. At the same time, there was a very significant art collection that is held by the Toronto District School Board, including works by the Group of Seven and many very famous Canadian artists. A.Y. Jackson did all the memorial scrolls in every school in Toronto. And there was a suggestion that art collection be sold, and I'm pleased to say that didn't take place, including a Tom Thompson in the principal's office at Riverdale Collegiate.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Great. And that's a very busy political career.
It was.
Yes. Did you have any time to get involved in any church organizations or other community organizations?
I did when I was younger. I haven't lately.
Mm-hmm. Yes, tell us about those younger days.
Well, obviously, I was involved in sporting events that were at St. Cyril and Methody. We had a gymnastics team, which I was a member of. We had a tumbling team, which I was a member of. And bowling. There was and still is a bowling alley in St. Cyril. And we were pretty competitive. And
was this a bowling group for the young people?
For
the youth?
For young Macedonians, yeah. And the hockey.
Do you remember the group? What it was called?
This is St. Cyril.
St. Cyril Hockey, yes, league, right?
Yeah. It was wonderful. My cousin Tom Mladenov actually led the gymnastics team, and he's a bit older than me, so he would be he was my mentor, and I'd go to gymnastics class with him every Friday night for a number of years. It was wonderful. And again, it drew people together. It allowed friendships to develop, and made me a lot closer with my cousin.
Mm-hmm. Do you still have those friendships that you had from back then?
I do, although it's a little harder. People are older now. They all have different responsibilities.
Yes.
People of my age have grandchildren, so the opportunity to see people that I was involved with at that time is limited, but when I do see them, it's a nice thing.
Mm-hmm. Great. And now a little bit about your personal life. Can you tell us about your wife and how you met her?
My wife is Mary.
Mm-hmm.
She's not Macedonian.
Mm-hmm.
She's Scottish background, but she has become a Macedonian in so many ways. Her Macedonian language skills are probably better than mine. She can make zilnik from scratch, which it's impressive to watch. And she's so involved with my family. So I'm delighted with that. We have two children. Molly, who is 30 years old next week, and she was born in October of 1980, 85. And I have a son, Cameron, who is 28. He was born in June of 1987. Molly is she's a graduate of 3 universities, actually. The University of at Trent in Peterborough. She graduated in a master's program from Leeds University in England, and then subsequently was a graduate of the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. She's not teaching. Obviously, that's something that may come. She works in publishing and is very excited with that. She was married recently to a young man from Toronto, so we're excited about that. And Cameron is involved in the motion picture industry. He is he's involved in set decoration, set movement, and some electricity. So he's doing exciting things. I'm not sure this is what he wants to do for a career, but remains to be seen.
Great. And Paul, you're definitely an example of a successful politician and a citizen, born to an immigrant family who came to Canada and was able to build a very meaningful life, working very hard.
Well, you know, I look at the achievements of my family, and I'm not unusual in that context.
Mm-hmm.
I have family members who are very successful. I'm sure that my dedo, when he arrived here in 1900, almost 110 years ago, would look and say, how is it possible that we've done so well? Because he came with nothing, like most Macedonians arriving in Canada. You know, we have lawyers and people involved in healthcare and very successful business administrators, politics, community service. It's really quite remarkable how well we've done, and I think that's true of so many of our community. The one thing I think that characterizes Macedonian people, perhaps more than anything else, is the industriousness with which we are blessed.
Mm-hmm. That's right. In talking about a little bit of history, I noticed that the ring you're wearing was a special gift from your father. Can you tell us
I inherited it.
Yes.
My father, it's a horseshoe in diamonds, as you might have seen. And my father was, perhaps by virtue of where the family business was, always involved with horses. He had thoroughbred horses. He owned thoroughbred horses prior to the time I was born. Some that were pretty successful. In fact, stake winners who were eventually, it was a mare in particular, was a mare that he sold to E.P. Taylor that was subsequently bred to the world record holder at the time that won the Queen's Plate. So that was a very significant accomplishment. He didn't get credited as the breeder, but he was certainly the original owner of the mare.
So having the Mecca grill close to the Woodbine.
Yeah, they were just so deeply involved. More later in their lives, I think they were more interested in harness horses than thoroughbreds, but it was very close to the business. It was the root of a lot of gambling. My father wasn't reluctant to wager on the horses or cards or dice, and neither were his brothers or sisters. They were.
They got involved.
They did get involved. And I grew up, as I mentioned, at Queen of Kingston Road, which is very close to not only the business but the racetrack. And my mother was enthusiastic patron of the horse racing too. So.
And who ran the restaurant business, the grill, for the most time?
Initially, my Baba and Dedo, and then I would guess around 1940, in the mid 40s, at the end of the war, it was effectively taken over by my two uncles, Louis and George, and my dad had absented himself to go to his restaurant downtown. And that continued until probably 1980, when my father returned. It was effectively, after he retired from his other business endeavors, he went back to the restaurant. He and his two brothers operated the business.
Operated the Mecca Grill?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And in 1968, they obtained a liquor license for the restaurant, which was extremely unusual for the time. It was very difficult. prior to about 1980, it was the onus of an applicant to demonstrate worthiness for a liquor license. It's now the reverse. The government has to prove you're unworthy. So licenses are granted almost invariably now, but at that time there were none. So they did extremely well by virtue of having acquired a liquor license, to the extent that they were sort of a focus for a very broad segment of the East End community. I recall teachers from East York Collegiate, which is fairly distant, it's close to Macedonian Place, but probably 2 miles from the restaurant. And they would come because they could have a beer with their sandwich at lunch. You know, that it seems so unbelievable now, but it was real then.
Right. Now, in terms of growing up in the Macedonian community when you were younger, Paul, and the involvement through your father and his volunteering, why do you think that type of community involvement was important for yourself?
Well, it was rewarding. I made friends that I hadn't had before. I could see the tangible results, certainly in this building at Macedonian Place, that the actual commitment, the idea that we were serving an important purpose. And I share that with my dad. It just is inescapable to me that we could not have a real sense of community as Macedonians in Canada without projects. And I'd like to think that there was a time we could embark on new projects of significant scale here too, to involve younger people.
Do you think that's important?
I think it's critical. I think our community has to have that.
And you mentioned about your father when he passed away. What date was that?
He left in May of 1992 and was followed not long after by my mother in November of 2004.
Did your father have an opportunity to go to Macedonia at any time?
He did not. He regretted that his whole life. He would have liked to, I know. And I haven't been myself, although I would like to go too. It's a little more difficult when your spouse is not Macedonian. But there will be a day, I'm sure, when I'll have that opportunity. I want to go. What I have done, and I would recommend it to anybody, is to go to Google, and when you Google Maps, when you get close enough, there's a function, Street View, and you can take the road all the way from Kostur to Laren, looking at the scenery on both sides of the road. It's truly remarkable. I went into the villages. I went into Oshchima. I went into Žalovo. I went past Laren to Banica. Yeah. Fantastic.
So virtually, you have visited Macedonia.
Well, in a really virtual way.
But it's definitely
there will be a day, for sure.
Something that you'd like
Absolutely.
to do. And perhaps with your children?
No, my children have not been either. When the time comes, for sure, I want them to go. I want them to understand their roots.
Great. And ending on roots, maybe we can have some advice from you in terms of the younger Macedonian generation.
Please get involved. Take advantage of all the opportunities that being Macedonian provides you. I don't know that young people necessarily understand that there's a community they can belong to that's successful and held in high esteem by the broader community, and can achieve tangible things like my father did, some of the things I was able to participate in that enhanced my life so much. I just think that they absolutely need to understand that there is an opportunity for fulfillment that comes through the volunteer effort that people provide to Canadian Macedonian people.
And on behalf of the Canadian Macedonian Historical Society, we'd like to thank you for taking the time to share this information about your family with us, and we appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Vesna.